welcome back to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. We're here on Tuesday, April 18th, and going to pick up our work on S42. So thanks, Chris, for joining us. And we've got a presentation that we should pull up on our devices. I'd like to introduce yourself for the record.
Sure. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Chris Roop from the Joint Fiscal Office. As you noted, I do have a brief slide deck posted under my name on today's date, and I'm not going to put my slides on the screen or anything, but it'd be helpful if you sort of follow along and walk through it as I go. I'm not going to read word by word, but you all are going to hear a lot of testimony on S42 in the days to come from people who are really in the weeds of investment management. You'll hear from lawyers. I am neither of those things. I know just enough to be dangerous. So I just wanted to put those caveats out there that my goal here is to sort of dip your toes in the water before throwing you straight into the deep end and introduce you a little bit to the topic and give you some food for thought. And hopefully afterwards, you'll be able to have a pretty thoughtful and intelligent dialogue with the folks who are going to be lined up to testify on this bill after me. So I'm on slide 2. You know, for newer members of the committee, I wanted to just refresh a little bit on how Vermont's pension systems are governed. Returning members of the committee heard about this ad nauseum in the last biennium when you all were developing Act 75, which created an expanded VPIC, spun VPIC off to be an independent entity, and made a few other governance changes. But just to remind everybody, Vermont has 3 major defined benefit pension systems statewide: VSERS, VSTRS for the teachers, and VMERS for the municipals. It helps to just look at those middle letters. If you see the T, that means teacher. If you see the M, that means municipal. The state manages all 3 of those systems, but the state budget only funds the first 2. The municipal system is funded by the participating members and municipal employers. So you'll typically, you all in the legislature will typically focus a lot of energy on the first 2 systems and not quite as much on VMERS, but VMERS would be impacted by this legislation as well. So each of those 3 retirement systems serves different bodies or different bodies of membership, different units of government in the state, and they all have their own boards of trustees set in statute that vary by size. And you can see here, if you're looking at this online, there should be some live links that will tell you who's on the boards right now. You can also find that information on the state treasurer's website. The trustees are responsible for the general administration and the proper operation of the systems. And the state treasurer serves as a trustee on all 3 boards. And the state treasurer's office oversees really the day-to-day operations of the systems. They've got a unit over in their office, the retirement office. So whenever you are a member of the system and you're looking to retire, you go to the retirement office over at the Treasury, at the state treasurer's office to process your paperwork, questions answered, so on and so forth. There's this 4th entity out there, VPIC, the Vermont Pension Investment Commission. They invest the assets on behalf of those 3 retirement systems. VPIC is comprised of 9 members, including the state treasurer. And you can see who they are here, but a key theme with all of these 3 trustee boards plus VPIC is that these retirement systems are governed by representatives of both the members of the systems as well as the participating employers of those systems. So whenever somebody, wants to ask a lot of questions about what's going on with the retirement system, sometimes it's helpful to remind folks that labor and employers jointly make the decisions over those systems. And that is a commonly found model in the public sector nationwide. Slide 3, something that is really important to highlight is, all right, what's you all's role in this process, the legislature? The legislature adopts the statutory changes to how the pension benefits are calculated So the formula that's set forth that will dictate how much I'll get in retirement many, many decades in the future is all set in statute by you all. You all also enact the statutes that govern how all these systems are organized and governed. So you all did Act 75 2 years ago to revise that. If you wonder why a board of trustees has, X number of members instead of Y number of members, well, because the legislature created the statute that way. The legislature will also create the amortization schedule and funding policy in statute. And probably most importantly, you will appropriate the money to fund the annual employer contributions to the state employee and teacher pension systems, along with the appropriation authority to operate the retirement office and VPIC. So the retirement office and VPIC are not funded by the general fund. They're funded by assets from the retirement systems. So when you all pass the budget every year, that budget includes appropriation authority from those retirement systems to the treasurer's office and to VPIC. So they have the ability to cover their own costs proportionate to the size of those various retirement systems that they serve. Something really important to keep in mind is what you don't do. You do not have responsibility over setting the actuarial assumptions. And you also do not pick and choose specific investments. You all created VPIC to invest those assets.
Representative Hango has a question.
So the obvious elephant in the room is why are we talking about fossil fuel investment from investments when we, the legislature, cannot pick and choose specific investments? I mean,
I'll respond. I can take a stab at that. So VPIC is a creation of the legislature. So the legislature did delegate authority to VPIC. The legislature changes its mind or sharpens its thinking on issues all the time.
fair enough.
But I think the point I'm trying to convey is there's not a group of legislators in a legislative committee in this building that sit around on a monthly basis with the investment consultant to figure out what to do in terms of moving money from one investment vehicle to another. You all have delegated that authority to VPIC.
Okay, that's a little more specific than the legislature, which to me means the whole General Assembly.
And you do create, you create the governance and you can set policy into statute, but in the day-to-day mechanics of running the operation, VPIC manages that money. So slide 4, VPIC, this just gives you an overview of who's on VPIC and what their powers and duties are. You have a sitting VPIC member at the table right now who can weigh in and color in the lines and correct me and keep me honest. But among other things, VPIC has the authority to develop the investment strategy, hire the investment consultant, develop the policies and procedures for investing money. They set the actuarial assumptions for the investment rate of return, the inflation rate, and the smoothing method. Annually conduct an asset allocation study. An asset and liability study is to be performed every 3 years, and they issue annual reports, which are a fascinating read. VPIC has 9 members and 4 alternates, and they serve staggered 4-year terms. So there is a term limit that set in statute that the members and the alternates, there should be alternates, not alternatives, shall serve not more than 3 terms and can only be removed for cause. The chair position, who is chosen by the other 8 members, has a limit of 20 years of service. And the law does have some experience requirements in it as well. So the chair must have the financial investment leadership and governance expertise as required by policies adopted by the commission. What I did not put on here is that statute also requires the governors two appointees to be financial experts who are independent of the system. So slide 5, I want to touch on this concept of fiduciary responsibility. And to really dive into the weeds, you'll want to talk to the folks at VPIC and the lawyers who will be testifying after me. But I wanted to just put this concept in your brains because it's a really, really important concept in the institutional investing world, or really in any world where somebody is managing money on behalf of somebody else, like a trust or something like that. And really the pension systems are a trust. Fiduciary responsibility is a very high standard of care that requires you to act in the best interest of the plan participants. What that really means is you cannot act in your own self-interest. You have to act in what is in the best financial interest for the people who benefit from that trust you oversee. The statute also says that VPIC shall strive to maximize total return on investment within acceptable levels of risk for public retirement systems in accordance with the standards of care established by the Prudent Investor Rule. What is the Prudent Investor Rule? This is a concept that is enacted in most, if not all states, that really lays out what this concept of fiduciary responsibility really means when it comes to managing assets and investments on behalf of somebody else. So VPIC, since they're covered by the Prudent Investor Rule, they need to manage and invest those assets as a prudent investor would by considering the purpose, terms, distribution requirements, and other circumstances of the trust. The trustee shall exercise reasonable care, skill, and caution. What this really gets down to is this concept of due diligence and being thoughtful, not being arbitrary in your decision making. The decisions that respect individual assets shouldn't be viewed just in isolation, but in the context of the whole trust portfolio and as part of an overall investment strategy, having risk and return objectives reasonably suited to the trust. So a trustee shall consider lots of factors, including, what's going on with the general state of the economy, what are the possible impacts of inflation or deflation, tax consequences, the total return from income and the appreciation of capital, your liquidity needs, the regularity of income, the preservation or appreciation of capital. What this all really gets down to is when we talk about pensions, a lot of times people will say, how come the pensions only returned X% return on their investments when my money returned Y% on investments? In layman's terms, we as individuals will invest our money differently than an institutional investor like VPIC would. So we all can tailor our strategies to our own individual tastes for risk, for volatility, for things like when we're going to need the money. So I'm in my mid-30s. My measly retirement savings are not going to be needed for a long time. I can afford a lot more risk now than, say, an institutional investor could, who is paying out hundreds of millions of dollars in benefits every year. And that's what's going on with the pension systems. So I can weather some really severe ups and downs in my tiny little portfolio because I don't need that money right now and I've got a long time horizon. But when you're investing a lot of money in systems that are paying out large sums every year in benefits, your appetite for risk is very, very different. So it becomes much less advantageous to try to get the best possible return you can in any one year. And it tends to be much more desirable to have a steadier return that has less volatility from year to year. Because when you're paying out so much cash in benefits, you just can't weather a massive double-digit negative return in 1 year the way somebody who's 36 and doesn't need their money for 30 years can. So that's just something to keep in your minds, that this is an entirely different world than what we all may be used to when we're looking at our 401ks or our Roth IRA statements. So slide 6 sort of gets to how institutional entities like VPIC often manage their investments. They develop an investment strategy, and that strategy considers, among other factors, the concepts of diversification and balance. Your risk management, you want to capture gains when the market's doing well, but also protect yourself from downside, from losses and from inflation. You want to minimize that extreme volatility that can happen from year to year if all of your eggs are in one basket. And again, liquidity needs. How much money do you need to pay out in benefits? Because you need to manage that as part of your overall strategy of where you put your money. So there's a little box over here that gives you some sense of magnitude of how much money is in the portfolio as of the end of FY22. So it's a little over 5 billion. I think the number's probably a little more now. But the biggest systems are the state employees and the teachers, and the municipal system is significantly smaller. You're going to see some words throughout this conversation that investors speak, but I wanted to translate it into layman's terms that, when you see the concepts of equities and fixed income, what people are really talking about are typically stocks and bonds. But that's not all that pensions invest in. They'll also invest in things like private equity and credit, real estate, commodities, all kinds of other products out there. It's really not just a list of stock holdings. It's much more complicated than that. VPIC on a regular basis will review their assets and their investment strategy, and they'll periodically rebalance things if market conditions evolve and the thinking sharpens and global economic situations change. But something to keep in mind is that, when you're talking about institutional investing like this, you're really not looking at short-term speculation. I can't underscore this enough. The goal here is to prudently and responsibly manage the investments with the best interest of the members of the retirement system in mind. We hear a lot about the assumed rate of return. The assumed rate of return is a long-term assumption. It's informed by economic conditions and expectations for future market performance. It's not like the tail wags the dog. It's not like VPIC sets the assumed rate of return and then plays around with the investment strategy to try to find a way to hit that number from year to year. They almost work in parallel, but on separate tracks where, the assumed rate of return is informed by things like long-term capital market assumptions, the state of the economy, expectations about inflation and interest rates and things like that. And hopefully that portfolio over time will generate a real return that is pretty close, if not better, than that assumed rate of return. But they're sort of parallel decision points that go into that process. So slide 7 just gives you a little overview of what the current investment strategy is. So whenever you look at these target percentages, they should add up to 100. And the way to view this is VPIC says that their goal is to have 29% of their assets invested in what's called global equities. That would be worldwide stock holdings and things of that nature. This allocation strategy really aims to maximize the total return on your investment, but again, within those acceptable standards of risk, subject to those diversity and liquidity constraints and interests. So you're going to see here that 71% of the assets are what's called growth assets. Well, you've also got some assets that are really intended to protect you from economic downturns and from inflation. So when I'm talking about trying to benefit from market growth, but protect yourself from downside risk, this is where you see that. You don't put all of your investments in one basket. You try to protect yourself from possible losses and also try to make sure you've got the ability that when the market's going up, you're benefiting from some of those gains. You will hear more from this from VPIC whenever they're in, but something to keep in mind is whenever we talk about these investments, we're not really talking about a giant list of individual stock holdings that you can just look down and trade, with a matter of a few mouse clicks. Much of the portfolio is invested in index funds and mutual funds. And those are vehicles that really aim to track the broader economic market trends at very low administrative costs. So untangling all of the assets that are inside some of those index and mutual funds can be a little more complicated than it may seem on its surface. Another consideration you'll hear from VPIC when they're in is around private equity and private credit. Private equity and private credit are much more complicated in that they tend to be our higher performing assets, but it's because they're illiquid. We get an illiquidity premium as a result of it. So it's not like logging onto your brokerage account and being able to buy and sell, your position in a private equity investment, in a day of trading. These are long-term partnership agreements that the funds enter into. They've got contractual agreements. It can take many years to unwind those investments. And in a way, you're kind of locking up your money for what can be a pretty long period of time in these private investments. But on the other hand, you tend to get a much better return on them. Something that I got to, but I want to underscore is direct holdings, meaning, a list of 18 shares in, Chris Roop's widget company. Direct holdings tend to be a pretty small part of the VPIC portfolio. Most of their assets are invested in these index or mutual funds or in private investment vehicles. Slide 8, this talks a little bit with some pretty charts from NASRA, the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, about the trends in the assumed rate of return over time. So ever since the Great Recession, public sector pension systems have been gradually lowering their assumed rates of return because the market conditions have evolved. Our expectations for investment gains in the future have evolved. Interest rates are lower than they were 20 or 30 years ago. Whenever you went back 30 years ago, it'd be really easy to earn a 7% rate of return by basically just putting your money in a savings account. And it is getting harder and harder just based on the way economic conditions have trended to hit 7% every year. So you'll see in these charts that we are not alone in lowering our assumed rate of return over time. Nationwide, pension plans have been doing that. Most recently, our rate went from 7.5 to 7% back in 2020. We're right in the median of major plans, but you're starting to see that the average is creeping down below 7% a little bit. These assumptions have typically been reviewed and, if needed, adjusted following the completion of an experience study. The next experience study is going to be due in the not too distant future. It's going to be due after the close of the current fiscal year. So will that upcoming experience study lead to another revision in the assumed rate of return? It is a question to keep in your eyes. Slide 9. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but folks who love pensions have seen this quilt chart a lot. This highlights in one graphic why diversification is important. Every single one of these little colored blocks shows you a different index that tracks a different asset class. And they are ranked from year with the best performing one of the year at the top and the worst performing one at the bottom. The obvious thing here is that from year to year, there is great fluctuation in which asset classes perform better than others. So this is a really useful picture, I think, to just underscore the point of why institutional investors don't put all their money in one type of investment. Because in any given year, you're going to have different winners and different losers. So I'm not going to go into the weeds of talking about the concept of correlation, but that just gets to this idea of, you don't want all of your investments to be moving in lockstep in the same direction all the time. If something's going up, you might want something that's not going up quite at rapid of a rate. If you've got one thing that could very well go down in an economic downturn, domestic equities, you want to have something that's going to gain a modest positive return to try to counter that out a little bit. Slide 10 just shows you the variation in investment performance over the years. I think you may have seen this chart before, but in 2022, we were not alone that we had a rough year. And the actuaries calculate investment performance slightly differently than VPIC does. It's a different methodology that, it's a different denominator, but you'll sometimes see a slightly different value in how the data is presented, but the trends are the same. That, 2021 was the strongest investment year since, I think, 1983. And the systems just, they were well over 20%. And then in 2022, the systems saw negative investment performance. They actually saw losses. So this is why we smooth the investment gains and losses over a 5-year period, is so for you all, when you try to figure out how to budget for the ADEC from year to year, you're not having that pendulum swing quite so wildly. So that black line on that chart shows you the smoothed out value, and that eliminates some of that, or I should say it ameliorates some of that year to year volatility when it comes to figuring out what your payments are going to be every year. But again, past performance is never a predictor of future results. The little chart at the bottom of the slide shows you what the most recent 5, 10, 15, and 20-year performance statistics have been. Our assumed rate of return is 7%. The caveat I just mentioned, a lot of these numbers are not too far off from 7%, depending on which time frame you look at. So slide 11, now I'm going to actually talk about the bill you all are going to take testimony on. Slide 11 just goes over the elements of S42. And I did put a fiscal note on the legislative webpage if you look up the bill number. And I'm not going to read that today, but this really does give you the contents of what's in it. That the stated legislative intent of the bill is for VPIC, consistent with sound fiduciary practice and subject to any exceptions, to divest the holdings of Vermont's 3 statewide retirement systems from the fossil fuel industry. The legislative intent is also for VPIC to establish a long-term goal to divest from any private investments, that's your private equity, your private credit, that contain assets in the fossil fuel industry on or before the end of 2040, if VPIC determines that such divestment is consistent with sound fiduciary practice. And I put this in red. This is an addition from the Senate Appropriations Committee that as part of their decision-making process, VPIC must include consideration of any expected increased funding requirements for the ADAC and administrative costs as part of its divestment plans. So the language in the bill would require VPIC to, on or before December 15th of this year, review the carbon footprint of the holdings of the 3 retirement systems and submit a report to the legislature by February of next year. The bill does not define fossil fuel company. Instead, it directs VPIC to develop a definition of fossil fuel company as part of its effort at reviewing the carbon footprint of the portfolio. The bill would also direct VPIC to develop a plan, once they do the inventory and they see what's in the holdings, develop a plan to divest any holdings identified in that review on or before December 31st, 2030. VPIC shall submit this divestment plan by September 1st of 2024. The plan shall include consideration of the state's long-term goal of divesting the assets that are exceptions to the plan on or before December 31st, 2040. And VPIC must develop this plan in accordance with sound investment criteria and consistent with fiduciary obligations. So I mentioned exceptions. The bill makes some very specific carve-outs from the December 31st, 2030 divestment deadline. Those exceptions are de minimis exposure to fossil fuel companies' stock, securities, and obligations, and the bill defines de minimis exposure as being less than 2% of the aggregate amount of all the pension funds invested. So it's not any one investment vehicle, whether or not fossil fuels are less than 2% of that investment vehicle. It's do fossil fuels comprise less than 2% of the holdings of the entire portfolio for the 3 retirement systems. The law also explicitly carves out private investments that contain fossil fuel company stock, securities, and obligations. So the bullet point up above directs VPIC to consider the long-term goal of divesting fossil fuels from those private asset for those private investment vehicles, but it doesn't explicitly require them to do so. There is no explicit carve out for index funds and mutual funds. So VPIC, under the way the law is currently, the bill is currently worded, VPIC would be directed to review their index funds and mutual funds and divest the fossil fuel exposure by the end of 2030. There are also some annual reporting requirements on VPIC that beginning on January 15th of 2025, VPIC would be required to submit reports every year on the progress of their divestment activities. So those reports would include updates on the composition and the percentage of exposure of any investments covered by the exceptions from the divestment plan, and a summary of any fee impacts or instances of excessive charges or demands related to rebalancing the funds consistent with implementing the bill. The annual reports would cease to be required after January 15th of 2040. And I think I had a bullet point here that was cut off, but there would be a final report due in 2041 that sort of sums up the total, once the divestment work was done, it was sort of a final report requirement to terminate the annual reporting and say, all right, this is where we are now. So slide 12, this talks a little bit into possible fiscal, some known and possible fiscal implications. Divestment is a policy decision, but it could have fiscal implications depending on how it is pursued by VPIC. We do know from testimony that there are a couple known costs of S42. One would be performing the asset review and divestment plan. So that sort of first step of directing VPIC to take a look at their holdings, develop that definition of the fossil fuel company. The bill as introduced had a $100,000 general fund appropriation to VPIC in FY24 to fund this. The Senate Appropriations Committee removed that appropriation. It is not that they are throwing cold water on the idea of funding it, but the way they construct the budget is when you've got a lot of one-time appropriations floating out in different bills and they make it through the Appropriations Committee. As a matter of course, they typically amend out the appropriations and put them on their list to then make decisions on what to fund in the big bill. Because otherwise it would be extremely difficult to balance the budget when you're tracking little one-time appropriations in all these little bills. So it was removed and put on the appropriations list for them to consider as they develop the big bill. There is also, and this continues to be in the bill, it was not scrubbed out, there's the appropriation to add a new position at VPIC. The expected annual cost of that new position would be about $127,000. It's all in, not just salary. That's anytime you see a number like that, assume that's not just salary. It's the benefits, it's the whole 9 yards. And that cost would be paid proportionately from the 3 retirement systems. So those are the known fiscal implications. There are some unknown implications too. What actions will VPIC take to comply with the intent? What impact will those actions have on future administrative costs and investment performance? And as I mentioned earlier, the bill does require VPIC to consider, explicitly requires them to consider the impacts to the ADAC and administrative costs as part of its divestment decisions. So below are 2 charts that just show the range of possible fiscal impacts for investment performance or ADAC changing. I am being very, very clear that I am not presuming that divestment is going to lead to poorer investment performance or to inherently changing the assumed rate of return. I think what will happen will depend on what decisions VPIC makes to comply with the stated legislative intent of this bill. So I don't want anybody to read this or what I'm saying and say, this bill is automatically going to lead to these impacts. What I'm doing here is raising, since it was raised in testimony, the range of possible impacts that could happen if decisions made by VPIC to comply with the intent lead to investment performance or the ADAC being adversely impacted. So if the assumed rate of return is lowered from 7 to 6.5% in response to either higher expected overall management costs or more limited future investment expectations, the ADAC would increase by approximately $25.2 million for VSERS and $29.2 million for the teachers system. Those costs would recur annually, growing in 3% future increments until 2038. If investment performance, net investment performance, if your actual performance were to deviate from the current 7% assumption by 1% either way, so if you did 6 or 8 instead of 7, the ADAC would be impacted by approximately $4.3 million for the 2 systems. So it's just over $2 million per system. So that's just to give you a sense of, it's one thing to talk about bullet points and what ifs, but these ranges of possible risk were costed out by the actuaries. They're relevant for any range of decision making, but it's sometimes good to get your head around just the magnitude of if numbers change one way or the other, what does that mean in terms of your future ADAC funding requirements? So slide 13. This leaves you with some considerations as you approach this policy decision and you hear testimony on this legislation in the next couple days. There's two strategies out there, engagement and divestment. You'll hear about those. Engagement is not taking your money out of an investment, but is literally what it sounds like. It is you are the investor and you are engaging with the management of the company that you're invested in to try to get them to change their practices. There is a lot of engagement work happening at VPIC right now. Engagement is happening all over the country in major pension systems as a way of accomplishing people's various policy goals beyond just trying to make the most money from year to year. Another question out there, so it's for you all to sort out what is the most effective strategy to accomplish your policy goals. Engagement, divestment, is there a way to have a combination of both? It sort of goes without saying that if you divest, you can't really engage because you're no longer a shareholder with sort of skin in the game to go to the company and say, hey, I want you to change how you do business. Another question which we got to early in the slides was, who should decide investment policy and how? Is there a conflict between the fiduciary duties of VPIC versus legislative-driven policy? That's for you all to sort out. Understanding the current exposure in the portfolio. We can sit around and talk about divestment, but what are we really talking about? How do we define fossil fuel companies? How much exposure is in the portfolio and in what types of investment vehicles? And what are the fiscal implications of divesting those assets? Those are all very relevant and important questions that I don't think we have answers to right now until VPIC really would do a deep dive into the first step of what would be required in the bill, which is to really review the assets. Divesting is complicated. I have heard proponents of divestment make the argument that it's as simple as looking at what's in the portfolio and selling it, and that cannot be further from the truth. How do you deal with exposure within index funds and mutual funds that track broader markets at low cost? So, if you have shares in a index fund that tracks the S&P 500, you're going to have some exposure to fossil fuel companies in there. And that is not just unique to the S&P 500. That's in all sorts of large, broad, index funds that are meant to track an economy or a broad market sector. And thinking about how to deal with the private investments, the private equity and the private credit. These typically perform better than your other investments because of that illiquidity premium. But they're pretty difficult to unwind. And it's not something that that can just, log into their brokerage account and get themselves out of. It's going to take a long runway and some thoughtful discussion on what divestment means for those private investments. And it all really comes down to what the costs and everything else that we don't know right now is all ultimately going to come down to what actions VPIC takes to comply with the legislative intent of this bill. So what fiscal impacts will those actions have? What are the administrative costs associated with having to develop an alternative investment index as opposed to maybe a super low cost, passively managed index that we're currently in? This whole issue of the private investments is going to be a topic of conversation. And I think one of the concerns, and I think one of the intents behind carving out the private investments in an explicit exception is, if you're going to lock up your money for a long period of time, you want to do it with a money manager that is going to be performing really, really well. It doesn't really pay off to lock up your money in private investments that aren't going to deliver you a really strong return. But we're not real big as a state. Our investments aren't real big. And I think there's a legitimate concern and question as to whether having an not even overly, any sort of restrictive statutory investment policy, does that hurt our ability to place private investments with top tier managers? Not that those top tier managers would inherently be taking our money and investing them in fossil fuels, but the question is it worth them changing their standard terms in their agreements to accommodate our relatively small investment and our restrictive investment statute where you could just have somebody else invest their money as well, and the money manager wouldn't have to change any of their standard terms. I think that was one of the considerations why the private investments were explicitly carved out of the scope of this bill. So you just want to always keep in mind when we think about things like administrative costs or investment performance, that if anything leads to spending more for your money managers or lowering your net investment gains, that when all else is equal is going to lead to higher employer pension costs in the future through higher ADEC. I think that is why the bill explicitly directs VPIC to consider those impacts when making decisions on how to comply with the intent of this bill. Another question that's just sort of hanging out there is the S-42 is specific to the 3 state pension systems, but what about other state funds? What about the OPEB funds? Are they worth considering one way or the other? It's just a topic of conversation. So that's all I have to sort of whet your appetites on this fun subject. And you'll have plenty of opportunities to really get under the hood with folks from the Treasurer's Office in the days ahead to really ask your really detailed questions. But if you have anything I can answer now, I'm more than happy to.
Chris, thank you for putting this together. It's a really good grounding document for what are the questions we should be asking about. What do the pension funds look like? Who governs them? Representative Hooper of Randolph.
So you say we're going to get a lay of the land at the end of this fiscal year?
Experience study.
The experience study, yeah. So the experience study will look at all of our actuarial assumptions and basically look at what's happened since the last study. How did that compare to our assumptions? What do we think is going to happen in the future? And based on all of that information, do we need to revise our assumptions?
Do you have any predictions?
None that I'm going to make on it. Let's put it this way. I think there are some assumptions that I think are very ripe to be revisited because I think we're in a different economic landscape now than we were 4 years ago. I'm not going to put my finger on the scale by any means. That is not my role. It would be inappropriate for me to do so. And if I was able to accurately predict the future, I'd be very wealthy right now, and I would not be sitting here.
Paying for the pensions.
And, you know, the pensions would be fully funded as well.
Representative Hooper of Randolph.
When we address Representative Hooper of Randolph, when we talk about assumptions, we're not only talking about money, we're talking about people, how long they're going to live, how long they're going to stay, sex, boom, boom, boom. It's a plethora of variables that impact how much it's going to cost us in the future, keeping always in mind that when we talk about the pension fund, we're talking about 30 years from the date that you're talking about as what we're planning for, sort of. So that's why an experience study gets thrown around a lot, but that's why it costs us a lot of money. And as an aside, when we do some of these things, state generously says you can take the money to do it out of the retirement fund, which effectively cuts your shoelaces a little bit instead of paying for it themselves.
An experience study, they're on the Treasurer's website. They are not as boring as they sound. The actuaries who I think they deserve the pay they get because it's a very difficult job they do, but they do a nice job sort of distilling this into a slide deck with a lot of graphics that will show you sort of, all right, what was the assumption? What was the experience? Was there a recommended change based on that? So it kind of takes all these words and puts them into pictures that helps you get your head around what we're really talking about here.
But actuaries don't speak English. And most of the assumptions they come up with are counterintuitive from what you think you've learned in life.
So the more they talk, the less you understand. The more they say, the more confused you get.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I found when we were really digging into actuarial analyses over the last couple of years with the pension bill that when you start to think about policy decisions that we might make and how that would affect things like when does a teacher decide to retire in their career, for instance, that that one variable could completely change the direction of when funds are getting paid out and when funds are getting invested. And so the whole model is a very complicated thing with a lot of levers that you could pull on the investment side, but also on the policy side for us. And since we do the policy work, we have to keep this stuff in mind as we're making decisions. Representative Nugent.
I was just wondering if there had been any more discussion around different ways to achieve this. Because I was looking at the who should decide investment policy and how like fiduciary duties of BPIC versus legislative has anyone discussed, or is there another option to direct BPIC to decisions based on our goals for climate change instead of going this route where we just tell them to divest? Or is that worth exploring?
I think it's a great question, and I don't think it's a question that Chris should have to try to answer.
My answer would be that is the question.
Yeah. So I know I had scheduled for us, and I know we have our next couple of witnesses on a completely different bill in the room. But what I would say, Representative Nugent, is that I think that's a really excellent question, and it gets at VPIC's job is to make fiduciary decisions. And we all, I think, can look at the fact that the world is changing and realize we don't want to be investing in certain things. And at the same time, the contribution to the economy of building a building for a school and building for a prison could be exactly the same, right? But we all know that they have very different outcomes in the real world in terms of where we decide to invest our dollars. And so it's similar to that kind of philosophical thing. It's sometimes we want to sort of put our fingers on the scale to Chris's point and say, we really want to make sure we're not investing our dollars in this thing because we have this policy reason. And that's what the Senate sent over to us with S42.
And my last comment is you can look at my slides, and my goal in putting these together is they're pretty agnostic to fossil fuels. I think you can apply what I'm saying to any type of investment you're thinking about. I mean, the concerns and the issues are universal in this conversation. It's really not unique to fossil fuels. So you can, if you don't want to invest in widgets, I mean, it's going to be the same considerations.
Just to clarify, I guess I'm wondering the specific fiduciary duties of BPIC, if you can add something in there that one of the duties would be to invest in things that are counter to our values or goals.
I see Representative Bronson shaking his head. I think what's tricky about that is then you're asking them to define what's counter to our policy values as opposed to us telling them explicitly, this is what we want you to do or not do. Chris has given us some very thoughtful things to consider as we can look at this particular set of policy questions.
It's sort of like if you go too far down that road, you become a fiduciary of the system yourself and take on responsibilities, and then who knows what's happening.
So Chris, thank you. This is a great foundation for the conversations we're going to have over the next, especially tomorrow with Mr. Galanka coming in and the treasurer. So thanks everybody for just the number of things we have before us, and we're jumping from topic to topic today. I have a request to have a couple of folks with some experience that happen to be in the building in law enforcement, specifically sheriff's offices, come and give us some testimony on S17. Is there a specific order that Representative Oliver?
Yeah, happy to go first. I waited here.
Okay. Sounds great. And Mr. Howard, were you going to testify this afternoon as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Representative Oliver, please take the hot seat. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you and everyone else. Quick introduction. I'm Oliver. Not Representative Oliver right now, I guess. as what we would define my other title to be is a state transport deputy. I have been a state transport deputy I've been going into my 25th year. I have worked in the sheriff's departments since 1988, full-time. I worked under Senator Norris's command of the Franklin County Sheriff's Office during his whole tenure and was his chief deputy when he retired. And I left at the same time and went down to Chittenden County. I wanted a different change of pace. Explain a little bit about what a state transport deputy it is. It's a little bit muddy at times, depending on who you talk to. We are deputized by the particular sheriff's office. However, our pay and benefits come from the state of Vermont. Our primary goal is prisoner transportation, extraditions, anything having to do with anybody involved in the judicial process until they become fully committed to the Commissioner of Corrections. And then we have had some issues regarding, okay, who's really our employer? And this is where it kind of gets weird. So the sheriff oversees us, and the Department of Sheriffs and State's Attorneys also have a vested interest in us. And recently we have become, by statute, employees of the state sheriffs, state's attorneys and sheriffs, with oversight by our sheriff, like our immediate supervisor. And when you have 14 different environments, one employee, it got a little bit crazy. Like, okay, so these people are handled this way. This is how they're paid. Other people receive different, okay, you work these hours. The schedules were crazy and the compensation was not always done exactly the same way. So we enlisted the help of the union and we are now hammering out our first contract. I'm the chair of the bargaining committee with the VSEA for the state deputies. And there's a couple things in this bill that we've identified that we have some vested interest in. We are in full support of the sheriffs and not necessarily what F-17 was. There's one particular item in the F-17 about shall provide port security. That's a very difficult thing these days with lack of employment or lack of employees. However, the VSEA is looking to suggest or provide hopefully 25 more positions so that we can fulfill a court function on top of the transport function. They may be separated, but at some point it may be good to integrate the two as one and still be a state union employee and just come from the state of Vermont. Or I don't see how it could happen instantaneously without supplementing some sheriff's deputies alongside with the state positions until it becomes fully functional, if that's possible. Another thing too, as union employees, we can see some of the deficiencies that you might find within a sheriff or something, sheriff's office that might be going wrong, differences between departments, policies, procedures. We think it would be a good idea if you do continue with the oversight committee or the study committee, we would like to have a member on that, a VSEA union state deputy member, if that's at all possible. There's a few other things I could go through and go item by item, but I'd rather take questions. But there's one that jumping out at me right now is regarding restraining orders and callbacks to receive property. That's the one that really jumps out at me. And I think it was because they figured that we were charging victims for this service. I've never seen a victim charged for that service. It's usually the defendant that would pay, particularly on a contract. They're the ones that need the service. And typically the service is almost always avoided by finding a mutual friend, relative, acquaintance between the two that can agree to make this happen without our involvement. with any police department, they should be able to do that. And it should fall under the jurisdiction of the department where that particular incident is taking place. If it's in Burlington, then maybe Burlington Police Department can do this escort. To mandate that the sheriffs just arbitrarily are going to have to do this without receiving any funding, it's not going to work. Any questions?
My first one would be on that score. We had heard some testimony, thank you, Representative Oliver.
Yep.
We had heard some testimony that there seems to be a diversity of approaches to how, when sheriffs are specifically asked to do that work around relief from abuse orders and property, return property, that sometimes sheriff's offices are charging. And
A victim?
and yes, and then maybe in the two sheriff's offices, the two counties where you have experience, that was not the case, but in other places we had heard some testimony
That's
that it
possible.
was. So I think that's why the Senate might have put that in there, but just food for thought on that. Representative Morwicki and Representative Hoover.
Thanks. When I work in family services, I've been part of situations, people wanted to go back and we were always advised to take law enforcement with us, that this is a flashpoint when someone's leaving. But are you suggesting they shouldn't have?
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that whoever covers that particular area that you need to go to, whichever law enforcement provider.
Sure. Okay. I thought I heard you say
No.
you should have family or friends.
No, well, lots of times, so long as you keep the two parties that are not getting along apart and one can get a mutually agreed upon person to go and do it, it's often very beneficial for everyone. We haven't had any problems with that particular suggestion. They can, if they don't want to have it happen, they just flat out say no, and we find somebody to go and do the escort.
Thanks for that clarification.
Oh, so your testimony was around the supervision of the courthouse as opposed to the transport, but combining them would allow for more flexibility, and since they're classified state positions, probably consistency and people staying for a career rather than.
I can expand upon that a little bit, I think. Well, right now, there's 25 of us state deputies. There are 25 slots. I think there's 18 currently active, somewhere around there. So we would need to first replenish that because we are hurting. It's very difficult to get everybody around. I hear about it every day being on a leave of absence down here. So, not really, but we would like to backfill those 25 and get 25 more. The only thing we need to run into, the only problem we could run into really is if a state deputy is assigned to a courthouse duty and we're not fully up to staff, they can't transport. So obviously I can assist a courthouse with court security, but if a transport comes in, I'm going to have to complete that until everything's fully staffed. Right now, if I don't have anything happening, I typically go to a courthouse and help out. I'll be either in Edward Costello Courthouse or over in the civil courthouse in Street Burlington until I get work, transport.
The question, hearing that you've been in the courthouse. In Wyndham County, where we are, went through a transition where the sheriff said, what you're offering to us doesn't cover my costs. So they brought in private security. The challenge with that is, going back to the family service work, if someone had to be put into custody, they can't do that. So we have to call one out to whoever could come first, state police, private police. So put you on the spot and say, does it make sense more to have sheriff deputies there, combination or private, which are usually less expensive?
I don't know what the private companies charge. I know what some of the sheriffs charge. I think the service of having at least a level 2 to level 3 certified officer in the building is good because you can have all kinds of things happen in there where they can immediately make an arrest and intervene, not just a firearm for protection purposes. So I would advocate for law enforcement, a blended service sometimes work. That's what they have right now at the courthouse, civil courthouse in Burlington, because we're so short staffed.
Thanks for representing.
Thank you. Representative Oliver, I just have one question. You said backfill 25, that's in addition, bless you, to the 25 more deputies that you would need?
And we need 7 right now, I think, to complete the first
Okay.
load, and then 25 more would be the goal. I'm not sure how that would all work out, if the sheriffs were going to be responsible for looking for the employees, or the state would do the hiring. I have no idea.
But that's the number of employees that you're currently short.
It's about 7 or 8. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I believe they are actually starting to reauthorize some replacement people. We were a little quiet during COVID, but now things are going full blast again for us.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions for Representative Oliver? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Norris, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chair McCarthy and members of the committee. If I'm in here, I'm not in the other GovOps. Listening to testimony. So, for the record, Senator Robert Norris, Franklin District. I'm sure you've heard a lot of testimony already, so I'll try to keep it brief. I've got a few issues in here that I'm concerned about on S17. Little history, full disclosure. I was the sheriff in Franklin County for 20 years, retiring on January 31st of 2019. Before I go any further, let me emphasize the fact that Vermont sheriffs, ironically, are not state employees. We're paid by the state, salary, benefits, and retirement, such as I think most members here, with the exception of the benefit package, okay? We work for the state, but you're not officially state employees. The office of sheriff is a county function. All employees of the office are considered county employees who are eligible for state retirement if the sheriff, he or she wants to put them into the retirement program, with the exception of, in some counties, 1 state paid deputy or up to 6, I believe, in Chittenden County. Now, having said that, you've heard a lot of testimony. I'm not sure more I can add, but in looking at S17, which came out of the Senate GovOps, I'm familiar with, I agree with some of it, but I do have some concerns about certain sections. Now, this bill started out as a quick 5-page bill, I might add. It's blossomed to a 17-page bill, and I'm sure you all don't do that here in House GovOps. Comes in at 5, goes out at 5 or 4, right? Well, having said that, my concerns are starting with Section 2, VSA 290. And most of these concerns and everything that you hear, most you can find in Title 24 under VSA 290. That's all to do with the sheriff's office by statute. Under Section 2, VSA 290, 10B, makes a reference to an auditor or designee may have at any time examined the books, records, et cetera, in the sheriff's office. Now, presently, well, not presently, I've been out for 4 years. The auditor would always do an audit of the sheriff's office books every other year. 7 counties would be 1 year, the other 7 counties would be the other year, but you always had what's referred to as a compilation on the off year. So you always were set to go for the following year. During that audit, you were charged accordingly. I believe it's broken down into thirds. County, yourself, and the state had to do the mandatory audit. Well, the way this section reads, it clearly states that the auditor can come in at any point in time and request an audit of the books. Now, having said that, I don't mind the auditors coming in and looking at my books when I was there. I think it makes it a better office of us, a better entity of us. I look forward to their expertise and their opinions as to where the weaknesses were within our facility. However, having said that, it is time consuming. It does take away from certain personnel within the office because they have to be on standby to provide certain documents for the audit. But the way that the bill is presently written, technically they could ask for an audit every month and still bill accordingly, according to the title that it was written under. That's just not feasible for a sheriff's office or anybody else. I don't see a problem with simply maintaining the current structure that's within the sheriff's offices. But the way this is written, I'm not sure why it's written this way, to be quite honest, on a monthly audit. A second section is section 5, 24 VSA 291, which refers to the 5% fee. Now, according to the Auditor of Accounts Office, we took testimony that in 1991, evidently the sheriffs approached legislators down here in Montpelier, and they were looking for compensation. Well, I think the legislature said, well, take 15%. This is what I was told now, but the Auditor of Accounts Office said, no, it took 5%. They allowed them to take 5% in 1991. So this legislature told them to do that in 1991. They have done nothing wrong with the 5% they've been taking. And every time that you take your 5%, you have to go to certain municipalities, any contract that you take it from. It has to be specified in the contract. It has to be the cost of the contract. And using a town, for instance, the town board has to vote on it. Put it before the voters. They have to, it's fully transparent. No one's hiding nothing. It's in the contract by law. It has to be in the contract. So to remove the 5% does nothing then, I personally believe, does nothing then, I say hand down punitive measures to sheriffs for doing nothing more than following the law. If you remove 5% from their ability to take from a contract or whatever, is that going to make them a better sheriff or a worse sheriff? I don't think so. They're doing nothing more than following the law that was presented to them back in 1991. Now, of course, nowadays, there's much more need for law enforcement coverage throughout the state of Vermont. So now their contracts may be larger if, in fact, they can find the personnel to fulfill these positions, which obviously seems to be a strain throughout the state. But I guess I had a hard time following the 5%. And I know that the Senate appropriation made some serious changes to that, which I thank them for, obviously. So they made some changes to it, but I just don't see the need to mess with the 5%, which is set by statute. They've done nothing, and someone can give me an example as to where they've obviously violated any statute in reference to their 5% statewide. Section 7, 24 VSA 293, providing a minimum of one deputy law enforcement officer for each county. Well, in Franklin County, and I'll speak from experience, we had 2 courthouses. I also had 3 full-time individuals there. I had 2 door screeners, and the Superior Court, criminal Superior Court, we had it referred to as a rover. But at any point in time, I could have anywhere from 6 deputies into the courts, depending on how many they requested. We got environmental court, we've got family courts, we got courtrooms that set up in the background as far as judiciary courts are concerned, so on and so forth. But I guess my recommendation there would be, and it'd be an expensive project, mind you, but at some point in time, if in fact, present statute says that a sheriff may contract with the court administrator's office. And 17 says they shall. Well, if you're going to put that requirement on then, you need to make sure that they shall hire appropriate workers to work within those court systems, give them the pay and give them the benefits. I know we're short of people right now from cashiers to law enforcement officers throughout the state. I realize that, but you have to allow them to at least start implementing the procedure to put full-time law enforcement officers in these positions, because per diems, as they're referred to, part-time officers, we have no control over them, or I had no control over them back in the day. They're either available or they're not available. That's all there is to it. And you can't make them come in if they say I'm not available. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. But a full-time law enforcement officer with the credentials that comes along with it is something that we have to be looking at. Per diem should be used to backfill positions such as vacations, sick times, whatever else, but not being in there on a full-time basis. But one thing that they did overlook in S17, which I personally would like to see them add into, where they're talking about, this is a sheriff's reform. This is oversight of a sheriff's office. I can give you several examples, but I'll start with Franklin County because I'm more familiar with that. In the November election, when a sheriff is elected, okay, in my particular case, I was fortunate enough to come out victorious over the incumbent, 12-year incumbent. I wasn't allowed in that office until February 1. And I can assure you that back in the day when sheriffs left, they'd take a lot of things with them because they could. Nobody looked at it any differently back then. Today, you can't expect to go in and run a county facility and have it decimated by the time you come into office on February 1. And a lot of the examples that you've been listening to and hearing about, I came into office on February 1, and my clerk was sitting there, my bookkeeper says, I got good news and I got bad news. I said, well, let's start with the bad news. She said, the bad news is we're over $70,000 in debt. You got a 24/7 jail you're trying to run. There's 4 people in there. You've got 4 cars in the backyard. The repo company is here to take the only one that runs. Another one runs, but it only has reverse on it. It was chaos. And oh, by the way, I have $747 in my checking account. That's the bad news. Okay, so you can't expect people to come into an office, a county office, and run this. So I think that the reforms or the oversight, and there may be some people that disagree with me, but I think that from the time that that person is elected, okay, and the incumbent is leaving, there needs to be some oversight in that office, because who knows what they can do with it. And I know there's a section in the statute that says that, well, side judges or assistant judges will sign off on any expenditures or whatever else. And then within 15 days, send it to auditor of accounts office. Well, that's all they do, folks. That's the only authority they have. They can't tell you how to spend your money, what you can spend it on, other than, oh, $15,000 is going for a new car. Yep. They have no yay or nay saying this. Okay, so I think that we need to look at those 3 months, those very precarious 3 months, that there's no one in the office besides that individual who may be leaving. And I don't know, he or she may be leaving with hard feelings, but it was cumbersome. It was somewhat challenging, I might say, when I came into office. But the community surrounded me. They worked with me. They helped me out. I knew a lot of folks. They made it easier for me. There's a lot of suggestions made, and I said, no. I said, the people put me into office because they figured I can do this job. Let's just pull up the sleeves, wipe up the milk, and move forward. And that's what we did. When I left office 20 years later, there was 2 cars in the yard out of 21 or 22 that still had payments on them. Every pencil in the office was paid for. He had over 6 digits in the checking account. We had a marine division. We had a snowmobile division. We had, you name it. I mean, 4 out of 5 of the schools were covered by SROs. Okay, I know what your thoughts are on SROs. Not really relevant at this point in time, but we put the first SRO into Missisquoi Valley Union High School. That was the start of it. But we came a long ways. We had 2 canines. We came a long ways during the program. And I got to tell you that to see the news, to see what's going on within the office now was somewhat disturbing, but I knew that upon leaving, I had no control over this. In order to maintain, I'd have to stay. And I said, 20 years is enough. I think I'll just pull the plug and walk away and hope for the best. So that's where we are, S17. I agree that there should be some oversight, but the 5 individual cases we're looking at, there's only there's only one that's still in office. And then there's 2 that are looking at potential criminal charges, and the other 3 are gone. I mean, so we have to approach this as oversight, reform, or punitive, depending on how y'all want to approach this. I know how I approached it, but that's neither here nor there because now it's in your hands. So having said that, I'm sure you must be just about time for a break here. So if you get any questions, I'd be more than happy to do that. Because I waited for a break to get over here, so.
I've got a bunch of hands up, so Representative Burwicki.
Thanks for coming.
Yep.
Because of the situation we had in Windham County, I am also concerned about this idea of having to put a deputy sheriff. And what if we stipulated that they were funded by the state, like the transport deputies?
You're talking about the court system, the sheriff's office is what we refer to, Mike?
In section 7, the sheriff shall provide a minimum 1 deputy certified as law enforcement for each county and state courthouse within the sheriff's county jurisdiction.
Right. Those are the positions that I say should be looking at full-time certified individuals at a minimum. If they're going to put 1 in, put at least 1 in each one of those courthouses.
Should we stipulate, because there's no funding stipulation there. The assumptions, I would guess, is that the sheriff's supposed to find that money out of the 5% he doesn't get anymore.
No, these would be state paid positions.
Okay, so I don't see that in here, but is that your assumption?
No, that's just my recommendation.
Yeah, and I
Should at least
would
look at it, is what I'm saying.
I think we need to put that language in there.
And you can do it, you can do it in phases, whatever that may be, but part-time certified and very professional trained security people, whatever else. I don't know if they're armed or not armed. I know they don't have powers of arrest as far as taking someone in custody, so on and so forth. So those are things that you have to consider when you push it through here. Or leave it on the wall. So you get a lot of them on the wall in here.
I want to say that I made an enormous exception to typical protocol by inviting Senator Norris to come and talk about this bill based on his years of experience as a Franklin County Sheriff. So I don't want to get too far into making recommendations about our approach to the bill, but I thought your testimony would be useful given your experience in the office. Representative Chase.
Did I understand you correctly that side judges do not have the option of withholding their signature from expenses in the last couple of months?
No, they can sign or not sign. That's entirely up to them. All I'm saying is all it represents is a signature. They reviewed the expenses that you submitted. That's all it does. And then in turn, they send it down 15 days after I leave office to the Auditor of Accounts office. They have no say over to whether you can or not, was the point I was trying to make.
Okay. Thank you. It's a check, but not without a line.
Yeah.
Representation is not going to be represented.
Question I've got is, that oversight piece, how do you see that possibly working out? Who would do it? And that's, I'm assuming from the time that you win election to the time you take office, you're talking about that window there.
Yeah, that roughly 90-day window, yes.
So you got any suggestions as to who would take care of that oversight?
Well, it's a bit of a sticky wicket. I guess it would probably fall back onto if given the authority, the assistant judges would be the first in because you have two in each county. Having said that, the way the system is set up right now, the assistant judges simply have charge over the county budget, period. They have no say over the sheriff's office. Even the executive directors, state's attorneys and sheriffs don't have any say over the sheriff's office, just the state paid deputies that they employ there. The sheriff answers to, he or she answers to the voters of the county. So I guess that'd be some place to start would be the assistant judges,
Okay, thank you.
but there does need to be something there, I guess.
Thank you.
Representative Hannon.
My question is, once again, as usual, about process. What did you mean when you said you made an exception by inviting Senator Norris?
Typically, I wouldn't invite a senator who wasn't the reporter of the bill or the chair of the committee in to testify about a Senate bill. That's unusual, but I did that specifically in this case because in due respect to him with the usefulness of Senator Norris's experience of 2 decades in the office. That's what I was saying.
Okay, so is that just something for senators or is that for reps also? Because I've been invited in to testify about a bill in a different body, in the other body, that I did not sponsor or report.
I would say it's not a hard and fast rule, so it gets broken pretty fairly often, but
Okay.
it's a little unusual.
News to me, thanks.
I'm glad you made that exception.
I thought it would be useful for us to hear your experience.
And stand up when you came.
And I do want to say, the way that you turned around the Franklin County Sheriff's Office when you took office and the way you left it, people like me from Franklin County deeply appreciate the work that you did there. I wanted to ask you when you brought up the condition of the bank account and the poor condition of the equipment that you inherited. Would you be supportive of us thinking about some way to provide some support, model policies, like beyond just the oversight, some ability for new incoming sheriffs to have a little bit more help and guidance in a professional capacity that was statewide. And one of the things I keep thinking about in this context is that, we've talked, the oversight and accountability is important, but that there's also this element that seems to be missing. Sheriff Anderson brought it up in some of his testimony that when that person gets elected, it's kind of entirely dependent on their character or their quality they don't have like a guidebook on what's the best way to run a sheriff's office. They kind of have to figure it out on their own. I'm wondering if we can provide a little more structure to that, rules of the road and how you manage your books and compensation and benefits, model policies, things like that.
I mean, that would be nice. It's kind of like having children. They don't come with an instruction guide or a booklet. I mean, but that would be nice to have something because I came off the streets as a patrol officer for 10 years with a local municipality. Got thrust into the sheriff's office at my own choosing of my dad. And I got in there. I said, "So this is the sheriff's office." I was like, "No, it's civil. A lot of the sheriff's office is civil versus criminal. I came off the criminal division onto the civil division. So it was a learning experience, but it's nice that you make note that the sheriff's office turned around in 20 years, but I can assure you, had I not surrounded myself with 5 or 6 core individuals, okay, this is not something that Senator Norris did by himself by any means. I can assure you that. You need to have good people around you, and I did. I had good people around me, and I had a 12-month plan when we started getting out the subject. After 10 months, we made it. I'm going, so what do we do now for the next 2 months? I mean, but yes, that would be great, Representative McCarthy, to have some guidance, and maybe the Sheriff's Association can work with you on that, or the executive director's office, someone there, because a lot of times you're coming in cold, not knowing what you're getting into here. And you have to represent the entire county for 4 years, so sharpen the pencils a little bit before you send these folks into office, I guess.
Any other questions for Senator Norris? I almost said Sheriff Norris.
Representative Senator, or Sheriff, Representative Senator, just don't call me late for supper and I'm all set.
Well, thank you very much for.
Hey, thanks for having me. Nice seeing everybody.
Have a good one. Thank you, Senator. Mr. Howard, would you like to take the chair?
That's a tough act to follow. Lower the expectations right away. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm Steve Howard. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont State Employees Association. We're really here to testify about Section 7, which is the section that we were just talking about regarding the court security provision of the bill. I would just want to first of all say that VSEA represents, among the 6,000 members we have statewide, we represent the employees, classified employees who work in the judiciary, so the folks who staff the courthouses. We also represent the 24 state deputies. Representative Oliver is the unit chair of our newest unit of those 24 state deputies that are primarily responsible for transporting, for transports, but also provide security in the courthouses when they are available. We represent the Office of the State's Attorneys, so the folks who work often in the court, either physically their offices are located in the courthouse or they are in court doing their job. We also represent the Office of the Defender General, not the attorneys, but the clerical and investigators in the Office of the Defender General. So the reason I raised that is because we are here really to support the idea of the positions that would be required to meet the responsibility given to the sheriffs in Section 7. We are here to advocate for those positions being state paid positions, state paid deputies. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, besides the flexibility that Representative Oliver spoke about, courthouses, at least three that come to mind, are not just workplaces that are controlled by the judiciary. The judiciary happens to be one entity in that building. But for instance, the Costello Courthouse, which is the largest courthouse in the state, also has the Office of Child Support, has corrections in it, has the state's attorneys in it. And in almost all these buildings, we have BGS staff that work in those facilities. So our position is that these deputies should not be contracted with just the judiciary, but should be contracted with the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, and they should be paid for by the state, just as the 24 state paid deputies are currently. Also, I think Bennington and Barry also have very similar setup to the Costello Courthouse. Bennington's courthouse is actually in the state office building. So you have more than just the folks who I mentioned. You have the Department of Labor and the Department of Children and Families, and all of the folks who we would represent in Bennington are in those buildings. So we think that this contract should be with the executive branch of the state and not just with the judiciary for that reason. The other, I think, 3 points we would make is that the one provision of giving the authority to the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs is to provide some consistency. And some of the discussion you were just having, Mr. Chairman, with Senator Norris, whether it's training or whether it's the human resource side of things, dealing with one entity for the state has proven to be very successful with the state transport deputies. It was a change the legislature made in the previous legislative session to bring some consistency throughout the state. So that's another reason why we would support it. We also believe it would make recruitment, which is a challenge these days, easier with the resources of the state, rather than having each sheriff try to find folks to fill these positions. The state has considerable resources in its effort to try to find and help the sheriffs find folks to fill these positions. And then finally, we would say that we don't think there's a need to reinvent the wheel. We have already a model with the current state transport deputies, and they have the right of collective bargaining under the statute. There is a bargaining unit that's already established. So by making these folks state paid deputies under the current statute, they would just become part of the bargaining unit that the VSEA currently has. And that would, I think, extend collective bargaining rights to the men and women who would fill these positions without having to go through a whole campaign and a whole organizing drive. They would know that, and it would be useful in the recruitment process, that when they became state transport deputies, if they were reporting to the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs, they would have the rights of a contract that would be negotiated on their behalf. And Representative Oliver is the leader of that negotiation, in addition to the staff of the VSEA supporting him. So we think that is an important element that should also be considered. There's no reason to start from scratch here. We already have something in place that would be easily expanded for these new positions.
Right now, there's the envisioning that we're basically just saying, and S-17 as it came over to us from the Senate, that sheriffs are going to staff the courthouses. And some already do. Some do and they can, and there's a couple that don't from the testimony that we heard. But the bill as it stands is silent on whether those deputies are treated like the transport deputies and our state paid employees, or whether they are just any deputy in the sheriff's office. Okay.
Right. Right. So our position is that the bill should be explicit and say that they're state paid deputies for the reasons that I just went through.
Any questions for Mr. Howard? That seems very clear. All right. Thank you for being.
Thank you very much.
All right. So the committee, that is the conclusion of our testimony for today. We've been given a lot to think about S-17. I will tell you that in consultation with some of the folks that I've heard from and in response to the testimony, that I have been working with legislative counsel on a couple of different ideas in response to some of the testimony we've heard. There's a couple obvious ones, like adding somebody from the judiciary to the oversight committee. I think there was good consensus from the committee on that. But I hope to have something that we can take a look at tomorrow. And we're going to be hearing testimony from the department as well as others over the next few days on this. So more to come, but I'm seeing that there are a few things we might want to take a look at in an amendment, and I'll put some language on the table for us to think about. And if other folks have specific areas where they'd like us to consider language, it doesn't have to be me driving that bus, but I at least asked Mr. Devlin to do a couple of things for us. So we can take a look at that. Hopefully tomorrow it'll be ready, if not Thursday. So yeah, any last thoughts before we break for the day? Well, thank you everybody for taking a ride through 3 different bills this afternoon. Appreciate that. We'll adjourn the Go Off Lab and see y'all back here tomorrow. We're starting at 9 o'clock, I believe.